let's start with the ISO 27001 certification audit itself, the one an external auditor from a certification body runs. Can you walk us through how it works? So what happens in stage 1, what happens in stage 2, and what does a company need to have finished before stage 2 can even start?
Yes. So the certification audit is obviously our end goal in the whole ISMS and ISO 27001 implementation process. And stage 1 is kind of a readiness check. Is the ISMS designed properly to actually further your information security goals? It mainly reviews documentation, your context of your organization, like reviewing core documents like the scope statement, the information security policy, your risk assessment, your risk treatment plan, your statement of applicability, and so on. When the auditor is happy with that, they can then recommend that you move on to stage 2. And if there are any major findings, you get time to remediate them before the stage 2 audit. And stage 2 is more about collecting real evidence that the ISMS is not just existing on paper, but working properly. That can be spot checks of certain systems. That can even be interviews with your employees if the auditor is coming personally to your site. That there is tangible evidence that your systems are working as intended. That can be logs or tickets or any other records of the processes that you have documented.
The next question. What would you say is the difference between a major and a minor nonconformity, and what happens after you get one? So can a company genuinely fail an ISO 27001 certification audit, or how does that work?
So a major nonconformity is if a control is not implemented at all, or if you have a systematic failing of a control. For example, you don't have a risk management system or you don't have an incident management system at all. So that would be a major nonconformity, something just not being in place. A minor nonconformity is if there is a small lapse in the system. So I do have incident management, but there was some incidents or one incident that wasn't recorded properly or that wasn't treated properly. But that's kind of the exception, not the rule. And if you do have a major nonconformity, yes, you can actually fail the audit, but that doesn't just happen suddenly. So usually if you have a major nonconformity, for example, in the stage 1 audit, you will get the chance to remediate, or it will even be flagged before that in the internal audit. So yeah, it's not that easy to fail the certification completely, but it's also not impossible.
Next question. So how does an auditor verify that a control is actually working? What kind of evidence convinces them, and where do companies most often believe they have evidence when they actually don't?
There are different types of evidence. So obviously you have documentary evidence, so policies, records, contracts, that things are in place. You have confirmative, like third parties saying, okay, we as a vendor, as a supplier actually adhere to these standards. You have technical evidence, so that could be logs and output from different systems and software tools. Analytical or verbal from conducting interviews with employees, for example. And you can even have physical evidence when you are checking how things are secured on site. I think a general misconception for many customers or many auditees is that it's enough to have a policy in place instead of evidence that you are actually living the process that you're documenting in your policy.
Talking about Clause 9.2, so this clause requires the internal auditor to be independent of the area that's being audited. So let's say in a 40-person company where everyone touches everything, how do you solve that in practice? And when is it worth bringing an external internal auditor?
I think in general, in a 40-person company, it will be hard to have somebody who fulfills all the qualifications and the requirements and doesn't have any conflict of interest. So it's important that obviously the person is qualified to assess and audit an ISMS, so they could be an auditor or a lead auditor. But they also need to have not been involved at all in the ISMS build and implementation process. And for a company of such a small size, usually somebody with that expertise will have been involved in implementing the ISO 27001. So there, it's always valuable to involve an external party for the internal audit. And in general, it's also helpful to just get a different perspective on your ISMS, on your processes and policies, and also the risks that you have registered for your company.
Great. Thank you. That's a good segue, I think, into the next question. So, speaking of ISMS, how do you decide the actual scope of your ISMS? What's the real risk of drawing it too narrowly? And does a narrow scope come back at you when a prospect security team actually reads the certificate?
That's a good question. I think in general, having a narrow scope is not so much a problem for the prospect security team or security assessment, but it can actually be a problem for your own company to have a small scope, because then you have all of these intersections and interfaces. For example, if you just have your digital product or your software development process certified for a very specific product or one project that you are building, and you don't have another product in scope, and you are mixing developers who are coming from one team to another team, and one of those teams is in scope and one of them is out of scope, that could lead to difficulties, because the developer team who is in scope will then have to comply to certain standards and complete certain trainings, accept certain policies. And when somebody else is jumping in from another team, they might not fulfill those information security requirements. So it can be more work in a way to define a narrow scope and have all these exclusions and kind of edge cases than to just say everything inside this development scope, inside this development process is in scope.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Right. Now, looking at timeline. So the certificate runs for 3 years with surveillance audits in years 1 and 2. What do those surveillance audits actually check, and why do companies that certified smoothly, perhaps, so often stumble at the first one?
Right. So in the surveillance audits, especially if you're doing with the same auditor that certified you initially, they will check for anything that was previously a finding. So if you had minor nonconformities or opportunities for improvement identified in your certification audit, they might check how you dealt with them until the surveillance audit. But they will also assess continuous improvement. So we always say that the ISO 27001 is not a one-off thing. And I think that's where the misconception comes from, that some customers treat them, or some companies treat it as such, whereas the whole chapter 10 of the norm is actually about improving your ISMS and having this like plan, do, check, act cycle. So you want to improve your information security KPIs. You want to improve your ISMS. And if an auditor sees in a surveillance audit that you haven't actually worked on the ISMS for the whole year, they might not be too happy about that.
Right. Okay, perfect. Thanks. So, last question. In sales conversations, your clients' own buyers increasingly ask for the statement of applicability, not just the certificate. What are they looking for in it, and what does that tell you about how an ISMS should be built from the start?
I think that ties in back to your question about the scope. So the statement of applicability really says which controls from the Annex A of the norm did you implement and which did you not deem applicable for your company. So for example, if you are remote first, you're cloud-based, and you don't have an office location, you might not need physical security measures, and you might want to exclude those controls from your statement of applicability and not do anything about that because you don't have to. But obviously for a prospect, for a buyer, it's interesting to know, well, which controls did you actually implement in terms of information security? And it gives them more information than just seeing a certificate that says, well, your scope is certified, but they don't really know what you did.